taken out of you would certainly impede your ability to gather resources and attract mates and whatnot, and certainly the death penalty would, and being exiled to Australia. But of course, yeah, I mean, these are all kind of after the fact. Just at least off the top of my mind right now, they're after the fact, more or less speculations, and they'd certainly require a bit more rigorous analysis.
That's a question I have. I mean, one of the biggest criticisms of evolutionary psychology is that they're just so stories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something happened, and then you look at it after the fact, and you can come up with a sort of valid, reasonable-sounding evolutionary reason to explain how it happened.
Yeah.
You know, it's this hindsight bias with the hammer of evolution can explain almost anything.
Yeah.
Really, even things that seem super counterintuitive at first. You know, after a beer and, you know, some arm waving, you can come up with this really cool explanation for it.
Yeah.
Does Owen Jones address that?
He does in other articles that I wasn't able to kind of dig into with the kind of scrutiny that I actually did with this one. I think I might have it, actually. I don't. Let's see. There's, yeah, I think, let's see. Not sure if this is the one. Yeah, there is one called Law, Evolution in the Brain, Applications and Open Questions, which I unfortunately wasn't able to do much more than skim, but it talks about kind of the standards of proof and actually being able to test and falsify these hypotheses. So yeah, I mean, I have a copy of it.
No, I mean, yeah, definitely.
But unfortunately, I wasn't able to give that the kind of scrutiny that I wish I could have.
I have like a general question. I think this would be for everybody. And you know, this is taking the sort of what was and what should be fallacy to heart. And you know, maybe evolution can explain the reasons why the law developed the way that it did to certain extents, different, you know, to varying degrees. And maybe, and just because that's the case, obviously that does not mean that we should appeal to evolutionary theory whenever we're trying to justify legislation, a punishment in a certain case or a certain kind of punishment. But let's say, you know, in cruel and unusual punishment litigation, say, to what extent do you think courts should be allowed to consider the evolutionary sort of framework in whether or not a punishment is fair or isn't fair? Like, for instance, let's say you have death penalty, you know, death penalty of juveniles being litigated, and a court. Do you think that, let's say it gets to the Supreme Court, which, you know, it has, and do you think that the Supreme Court should be able to say, well, one of the arguments in favor of it is that this kid has killed, you know, 3 people, and this way we'll make sure that he'll never be able to reproduce and put those genes back into the population, or, you know, this, or another argument would be, or this is, it's okay to kill him because the law has developed via an evolutionary framework, and this makes some evolutionary sense, and that's one of many arguments that we'll use. Now, that might not be the definitive argument, but do you think it should be a argument that a court is allowed to use, evolutionary theory?
I mean, my sense of it is, I mean, it sounds like, I don't know if that's sort of tying in with this naturalistic fallacy thing of saying, well, this is evolutionary, so it's sort of somehow more valid or okay, but I sort of feel like that's not a valuable way to apply evolutionary theory to analysis of law. My take on it is that the most helpful thing that being conscious of evolutionary theory can do is sort of point to places where we're inclined to think things that don't really make sense for us anymore, but made sense from an evolutionary point of view. So, you know, for example, you put yourself in a moral situation where you have to choose between smothering your baby or saving the whole village or whatever, nobody's going to want to smother their baby because we evolutionarily were repulsed by that. It's horrible. So there's a rational part of our brains that functions much better at making a sort of right decision in that situation. Like if you look at it rationally, the baby's going to die either way. One way the rest of the village goes, or the other way, it's just the baby. I mean, from a purely rational point of view, that's a no-brainer, right? But evolutionarily, we just are too repulsed by that to be able to make the decision. So that might be a situation in which understanding of evolutionary mechanisms is valuable to making decisions about how the laws can work. But I don't think that it can possibly be valuable from the point of view of saying, okay, we're just sort of naturally inclined this way because of evolution, unless that's sort of a starting point for saying, well, why are we naturally inclined that way? Does it serve some valuable function that it can continue to serve? Which I think is what you're suggesting, actually. But that at that point, I think it sort of requires that it maintain itself on some separate rational ground, rather than purely sort of, if that little evolutionary just so story or whatever can get you around to seeing a rational justification for something that you couldn't see before, then I think that's possibly valuable. But if it's just purely for the sake of saying, well, that was evolutionary, so let's give it a little bit more weight, that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Because I mean, like, that does seem to be the thing. These are sort of vestiges of a world that we don't really live in anymore, anyway. It seems like that's sort of part of the point, I think, is that our world has changed too much for most of these sort of evolutionary vestiges to really be, per se valid.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I guess my general take on your question would be that we should basically never use it to justify anything, but really just to understand. And then once we understand these things from a clearer perspective, we can use our modern senses of values and ethics and morals and examine it through those lights. But I think that whether you're going to use it to justify or not, it's useful to understand why the threat of the death penalty should be something that deters people from crime, or why prison is something that deters people from crime. It should certainly, I think, be something that informs the discussion, but never something that goes so far as to justify any particular policy.
Right, exactly. To get to your point, to your example, do you think it would be fair if you were the, say, counsel for the woman who let the village die? Do you think it would be that court should allow your argument that she, for evolutionary reasons, to justify her decision?
I mean, I think if she's going to be tried before a jury, that's, everybody's going to have the same, I mean, we're all, presumably that's sort of like one of the things the jury is really good at is understanding what a sort of reasonable human reaction is in a certain situation. And so that's already sort of, I think, part of the calculus.
It's implicit in what's been going on, sure, but I mean, what about like an explicit evolutionary argument? Do you think that, like, bring an expert in to say, what, natural selection has selected for this behavior since time immemorial. It's as much her fault for doing this as it is that, we have opposable thumbs. They're both almost definite conclusions from a chain of evolutionary selection. Do you think that would be a fair argument for you to make as service counsel?
That's interesting. I mean, there's all sorts of, that would be a hard question on whether that expert is qualified to, I mean, there would be all sorts of
that's a totally different issue. Absolutely.
questions about the expert testimony.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think that you could, I think that's a good argument. I don't know if it necessarily strategically gives you much more than you would have already by saying, well, imagine yourself in this situation. I think you get almost as much from saying, imagine yourself in this situation.
Maybe.
You would have, if you switched it over to something a lot less sympathetic, like, the reason that this guy was unfair.